optimism still yet, or has that been extinguished in your mind?
Well, I think perhaps the positive thing is that so many Sudanese are saying no to the war. They're refusing to take sides. They're saying this isn't our war, this is a war between the generals, got nothing to do with us. In fact, it's just incredibly distressing that this is happening, and of course so many people are losing their lives in the process. So I think the flame of hope, determination, to continue to press for democratic transition is still very much alive. The Sudanese people absolutely don't want to get involved in this, and of course for most Sudanese people they just want the fighting to stop as soon as possible.
So a civil war, not necessarily?
Well, so far civilians have not been drawn in, but it all depends on how long this goes on, and that of course means it's absolutely essential the international community applies maximum pressure as quickly as possible. They should not wait to see who gets the upper hand or how this turns out. They should press very, very hard to get a humanitarian ceasefire as soon as possible to save lives.
Mohamed Hashim, is Sudan heading for civil war?
The more we sink, it just seems like we can sink even deeper and deeper and deeper into it.
There's nothing to plug the hole.
There's nothing to plug this hole at the moment. The one thing is the awareness of the Sudanese civilians who've maintained the peaceful protest thus far 4 years into this uprising is that they will have their way. I mean, ultimately, the problem is there are too many guns. It's a country with 8 million pieces, and whatever remains, I'm hearing stories where people are telling me, our soldiers who are trying to flee the fighting locations are handing over their Kalashnikovs for as cheap as $15, $20.
Murithi Mutiga in Nairobi, is Sudan heading for civil war in your judgment?
I think that the risk you see when a conflict is protracted is the risk of fragmentation, that you will increasingly lose the capacity to have defined combatants. There are multiple armed groups waiting on the wings. This is a vast country which has a history of multiple insurgencies. As you know, the quicker that you get a pause, the better. The problem is that the mediators have to grapple with the question of, even if you can secure a pause now, what happens with this nettlesome question of the integration of the rapid support forces into the army? I think that's a question that will follow very soon after, as we've had. I think it's encouraging, one, that even external actors haven't got involved very substantially yet. There's been impressive unity among various Sudanese in rejecting the conflict, but the longer it goes on, the greater the risk that more and more actors will get involved, and the harder it will be to resolve.
Well, that's it for this week on The Real Story. A great thanks to our guest, Dame Rosalind Marsden, an Associate Fellow at the Chatham House think tank in London, a former EU Special Representative for both Sudan and South Sudan, and also Britain's former Ambassador to Sudan. Murithi Mutiga is with the Africa Programme at the International Crisis Group. He's an expert on the Horn of Africa. And my colleague, Mohamed Hashim, BBC journalist who's an expert on Sudan and who grew up in the capital, Khartoum. That's it from me, Sean Lay, and all of us on the team at The Real Story. Thank you for your company. Do join us again next time.
This is the BBC World Service, and in the next forum,
we'll be exploring the impact the mobile phone is having on our lives.
There is a psychological attachment of people to their phones, which really makes them move beyond being a tool.
How did we get to the point where we're almost totally dependent on them?
The forum, how the mobile phone changed everything. Today at 11 GMT. In 30 minutes, Dear Daughter with Namolanta Combo.
I'm talking to Alejandra about her decision to leave Cuba in search of a new life abroad, and a very special letter she got from her grandmother. Full of advice for the future, her grandma also reminds her to remember her roots.
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 4 hours GMT, you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Barlow. Coming up.
This decision really means almost nothing. The ruling that they were looking at have already made some restrictions that are going to continue to confuse women. They're going to continue to make Mifepristone harder to get.
The US Supreme Court maintains access to an abortion pill while a legal appeal against its use is considered in the courts. Also to come, Sudan continues to be rocked by fighting, despite the two opposing generals pledging to respect a 3-day truce. Meanwhile, explorers have found the wreck of a Japanese transport ship which was torpedoed in the Second World War, killing more than 1,000 people. We'll also ask why a former Peruvian president has handed himself in for extradition, and...
Ready? Do you want to talk to her? You do? Okay.
Hear why parrots have learnt to make video calls, all to come here on the BBC World Service.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The US Supreme Court has ruled in favour of maintaining access to an abortion pill while a legal appeal against its use is considered. The decision temporarily blocks a lower court's ruling that restricted the use of the drug Mifepristone. President Biden welcomed the decision. From Washington, Jessica Parker reports.
After several rounds of complicated legal wrangling, this decision from the Supreme Court landed hours before a self-imposed deadline. It preserves the status quo for now. Mifepristone, which is normally used as part of a 2-drug regimen, will continue to be available as it was before, where abortion remains legal. Individual states in the US have been able to ban or severely restrict abortion since the overturning of Roe v. Wade last year.
Carol Tobias, the head of the anti-abortion group National Right to Life, said she hoped the final legal decision would confirm the fact that abortion drugs were dangerous to women. A court in Paris has convicted a Lebanese-Canadian university professor of carrying out a deadly bomb attack on a Paris synagogue in October 1980. Hassan Diab, who's now 69, was tried in absentia after he refused to return from Canada to France. Warren Bull reports.
4 people were killed and around 40 injured when a motorcycle bomb exploded near a synagogue in the Rue Copernic in Paris. It was the first attack on the Jewish community in France since the Second World War, and Nazi sympathizers were suspected. The judges then focused on a Palestinian militant group and accused Hassan Diab of planting the bomb. He was extradited from Canada in 2014, but was allowed to leave France after a court failed to conclusively prove his guilt. The murder charges were then reinstated, but France did not issue a new arrest warrant, and Diab refused to return. Canada must now decide whether to extradite him again to serve a life sentence.
Reports from Sudan say that fighting between the forces of 2 rival generals has continued in the capital Khartoum despite their declarations of a temporary truce. Explosions and firing have been heard even after the Sudanese army's announcement that it would observe a 3-day halt to fighting to allow residents to celebrate the end of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. The top US general has discussed the safety of Americans in Sudan with the country's army chief. General Mark Milley, chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, spoke by telephone with General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. John Kirby is the White House spokesman.
Our focus right now is sort of twofold. One is making sure we've got and can maintain full accountability of our government personnel there in Khartoum. And number 2 is working closely with people on the ground, particularly having conversations with both sides to try to get meaningful, sustainable ceasefires in place. Thus far, we haven't been able to do that, and the violence continues. It's still a very dangerous place.
This is the latest world news from the BBC. Peru's former president Alejandro Toledo has turned himself in to US authorities for extradition to his home country, where he faces corruption charges. Shortly before surrendering himself to US Marshals, Mr. Toledo said, "I asked the Peruvian justice system not to kill me in prison, but let me fight with arguments." The bodies of 4 missing Colombian miners have been found following a shaft collapse on Wednesday night. 11 people were trapped in the mine in central Colombia after an explosion in one of its tunnels. Argentina has recorded its deadliest dengue fever outbreak. Officials have confirmed 45 deaths and more than 65,000 cases of the mosquito-transmitted disease since the beginning of the year. Our Latin America regional editor Mimi Swaby reports.
These latest figures emerged on Friday only hours after the Minister of Health assured Argentines that the rate of infection was slowing and would soon plateau. The spike in cases is being attributed to more mosquitoes moving further south. This is due to the rise in temperature in Argentina and around the world, meaning mosquitoes are thriving, and so is dengue fever. Argentina's government is now attempting to fight this record outbreak by sterilizing mosquitoes using radiation that alters their DNA before releasing them into the wild to produce unviable offspring.
Explorers say they found the wreck of a Second World War Japanese transport ship which was sunk by a US submarine in 1942. More than 1,000 people were killed, most of them Australian prisoners who the American submarine crew had not realised were on board. The explorers discovered the wreck at a depth of 4 kilometres off the coast of the Philippines 12 days after they began the search in the South China Sea. The ship, Montevideo Maru, was carrying prisoners of war and civilians from more than a dozen countries. Its sinking was one of the worst maritime disasters in the world. BBC News.
You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Gareth Barlow. The US Supreme Court has decided that the abortion drug Mifepristone, which has been widely used in the country for over 2 decades, can continue to be sold. That's while a legal appeal against its use continues through the courts. This is what Gloria Phelps, the former president of Planned Parenthood, had to say about the ruling.
This decision really means almost nothing. The ruling that they were looking at has already made some restrictions that are going to continue to confuse women. They're going to continue to make Mifepristone harder to get. I suspect that the court is going more slowly because they know they have a big political tiger by the tail, and that whatever way they go, they're going to be criticized in many different ways.
Well, the BBC's Jessica Parker has been taking a closer look at what's in the ruling.
The actual order, where they basically say that Mifepristone access is going to remain as it was for now, is very short. The greatest substance of the pages that I'm leafing through here is actually the dissenting words from Justice Alito, who is outlining why he hasn't agreed with the overall ruling, saying that he didn't think that the administration and the manufacturer of the drug were entitled to this block because they hadn't shown they were likely to suffer irreparable harm in the kind of interim period. But the broad and probably most important point for now is that access to Mifepristone in states where abortion remains legal has not changed, but that doesn't mean to say it won't change in the future, because the legal wrangling is just going to continue.
Yes, legal wrangling that started in Texas, another case that was happening in Washington. We've now got this for the Supreme Court. All the while, people going about their daily lives and potentially needing to access abortion services. It paints a very confused picture now across the United States.
It does, and I think that pro-choice activists and clinics that I've been speaking to, they feel a few things on this matter. That yes, it has caused confusion, and indeed clinics I was speaking to in the last week or so were saying that they were getting calls from women as this thing was moving through the court saying, should I still come for my appointment? Should I travel? Should I get on that plane? Because maybe some women were travelling from quite far away if they live in states where abortion is illegal. Should I make that long car journey? And clinics themselves were a little bit confused because, as you say, there were rival rulings about what should happen with Mifepristone. So some of them were stocking up on this alternate drug that's used alongside misoprostol, as part of a 2-drug regimen. Now, that other drug can be used on its own, but it kind of has more severe or worse side effects for women during abortion. But they were doing some stocking up just in case suddenly Mifepristone wasn't available. So yes, quite a lot of confusion. And I think as well, pro-choice activists feel, and we were getting a hint of it there, that this is all part of an effort by those who are anti-abortion to have a bit of a chilling effect on abortion access, even if they're not winning in the courts day by day.
The BBC's Jessica Parker. In Sudan, heavy fighting has continued and spread throughout Khartoum despite desperate efforts to negotiate a ceasefire to mark the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr. At least 400 people have been killed in a week of fighting between the army and its bitter rival, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The latest hostilities come despite both sides pledging to honour a 3-day truce. Our correspondent Mohammed Osman is in the capital, one of only a few journalists reporting from the city where 5 million inhabitants are living in fear.
Battles have been going for a week in Khartoum. Insecurity is increasing, but some still went to pray. They could hear fighting from across the city.
We were afraid, but there is nothing we can do about it. We're used to praying here every Eid. The streets were empty, which frightened us, but we hope that next Eid things will be better.
It's a sad Eid. We hope that God raises this hardship and protects everyone. Sudan doesn't deserve this. Sudan doesn't deserve this. These people fighting should see how the situation in the country turned out to be and how people are handling it.
From this conflict, a humanitarian crisis, hundreds dead, thousands injured, most hospitals stopped. The army's leader still hopes for victory.
The destruction and sounds of bullets have left no room for happiness, which our people all over our beloved country deserve. We're truly saddened by how events have unfolded, but hope remains that we will overcome this ordeal.
The streets here are empty. It is hard for people to get food and clean water. Some are making the dangerous journey out of the capital, despite the risk.
We were born here, but the fight is near us, and we can't sleep because of fear. We left our homes, my children, and I went towards the city of Mishimadi.
People left here don't have the luxury of time. They're hoping their prayers will be answered, and soon.
That was the BBC's Mohammed Osman. Well, it's not just Sudanese citizens who are trapped in the city or trying to seek refuge elsewhere. The European Union estimates that at least 1,500 EU nationals could need to be evacuated. And for its part, the United States has not yet ordered its diplomatic staff to leave Sudan, but President Biden has ordered more special forces to the region in case they're needed. John Kirby is the White House spokesman.
Our focus right now is sort of twofold. One is making sure we've got and can maintain full accountability of our government personnel there in Khartoum, and we do. We have them all now consolidated and together and all accounted for. Number two is working closely with people on the ground, particularly having conversations with both sides, the Rapid Security Forces Commander and the Sudanese Armed Forces Commander, to try to get meaningful, sustainable ceasefires in place. Thus far, we haven't been able to do that, and the violence continues. It's still a very dangerous place.
Our correspondent, Kaukedan Yibatal, is monitoring developments in Sudan from neighbouring Ethiopia.
Despite the announcement of the truce, 72-hour ceasefire by both fighting parties, we understand the fighting is still going on. Residents, particularly in the city of Khartoum, report hearing gunfires and also airstrikes. It seems that while both the RSF and the army say that they want to give the people a chance to celebrate Eid and also for civilians trapped in the conflict zone to be evacuated and get help. What is happening on the ground is still raging fighting, and this fighting is happening in urban centers, and that is very dangerous, and there is a concern that the casualties could increase, the impacts could be very drastic.
We've heard of people struggling to find food, water, medicines, and reports now of large numbers of civilians heading for the border with Chad, for example.
Yes, indeed. Many people particularly are desperate to leave the city of Khartoum, where most of the fighting is happening, and whenever there is a break in the fighting, whenever there is a chance for people to move around, they immediately try to escape this violence and try to leave the city. But not only the city, we're hearing many people leaving the country as well. If the fighting continues to drag on and if it becomes a protracted conflict, all the countries in the region and many of Sudan's neighbors can brace for an influx in refugees.
And what about foreigners trying to leave the country? We hear there that the EU is considering it, the US moving some of its forces around to the region. How possible is that?
It's not just the US and the EU, but other countries including Canada, the UK, and countries like Sweden have been considering ways to evacuate their nationals from Khartoum and from Sudan. But the problem is, since this violence is still raging on, it's going to be very difficult for them to evacuate their nationals out from there. The RSF earlier said that they are ready to allow the airports to function for evacuation purposes, but it's not clear how much control they have, over the airports. But what's understandable is that, many of the countries, particularly countries in the West, are exploring options how to get their nationals out if this violence continues to escalate.
That was the voice of Kaukedan Yibatal. In June 1942, at the height of the Second World War in Asia, a Japanese transport vessel, the Montevideo Maru, was torpedoed and sunk by a United States submarine. The sinking was initially seen as a success. That was until the Americans discovered that the ship was almost entirely carrying nearly 1,000 Australian prisoners of war. Now, more than 80 years later, the wreck of what is considered Australia's worst ever maritime disaster has been found by deep-sea divers off the coast of the Philippines. For more, we're joined from Sydney by our correspondent Phil Mercer. And Phil, this discovery surely triggering painful memories for many, many Australians.
Yes, this is an enduring and a painful maritime mystery, the location of the Montevideo Maru stretching back 80 years. The disaster affected more than a dozen countries, from Scandinavia to Japan, New Zealand, the United States, and also here in Australia. It was estimated that 979 Australians were on board the Japanese transport ship. It was Australia's worst maritime disaster, and finding the vessel could well bring comfort to relatives who've waited those 8 decades for answers about the location of the wreck of this vessel that was torpedoed by the American submarine, the USS Sturgeon.
What happens now that they've found this wreck? What about the remains of the people on board? Will there be any recovery efforts? What's the proposed plans?
Well, this ship was found in waters more than 4,000 meters deep off the coast of the Philippines in the South China Sea. This was a joint effort between the Australian Department of Defence, marine archaeologists from the Silent World Foundation, and also deep-sea survey experts from the Netherlands. After 12 days, a positive sighting was reported, and it took experts using an autonomous underwater vehicle with a built-in sonar to get that final confirmation that the Montevideo Maru had been found. And experts say that artifacts, items on the ship, and more importantly human remains, will be left there, because as one of the experts involved in the expedition said, that essentially they had found the maritime graves of more than 1,000 people, and it will be left undisturbed.
And this is a particularly auspicious time to do so, as it comes just ahead of Anzac Day, which remembers those in Australia and New Zealand who lost their lives in conflicts. But for the moment, Phil Mercer in Sydney, thank you. Now, we all know that parrots have an incredible ability to pick up new skills and also mimic others. Well, now a study in the United States has shown that they can learn to make video calls. That's right, video calls. And doing so might make pet birds feel somewhat less isolated. Iona Hampson has been finding out more.
Eleanor makes a video call with Theo.
Here's your friend Theo.
What makes this interaction remarkable is they are both parrots who have been taught how to make a video call using a tablet computer. A transatlantic team of researchers helped teach 18 pet parrots in the US how to make the calls. First by encouraging them to ring a bell.
Do you want to call a friend?
Then tap their beaks on the tablet screen to choose which of several parrots they'd like to speak to.
Ready? Do you want to talk to her? You do? Okay.
What surprised the researchers and owners was that after 2 weeks of training, the parrots were asking to make video calls without being prompted. In the wild, parrots live in flocks, but about half of the world's 100 million parrots live in captivity, where they are often kept alone or in small groups. Experts say isolation and boredom can cause the parrots to develop psychological problems, which can be shown by rocking, excessive pacing, or self-harm-like behaviours, including feather plucking. The researchers concluded that teaching parrots how to make video calls improved their well-being, and even allowed them to learn skills from each other, including singing and preening.
Eleanor, who would you like to call this time?
So how do you become a popular polly and have lots of pals? Well, the researchers found the parrots that called the most had the most parrots calling them back.
That was Iona Hampson with that remarkable story. Still to come on the newsroom, we'll have all the latest from the world of sport. It's a particularly busy weekend coming up, so don't go anywhere. It's just coming up to 0420 GMT.
And that's where we part company with the BBC World Service for another night as we rouse Radio 4 from its slumbers. And you're very welcome to join us. It's Chris Aldridge here with my colleague Nicola Bruff at the controls. We'll be monitoring conditions on the high seas in a moment, as usual. First, though, a wander up the stairs for some hidden history.
Attics can be quite sinister spaces, I think, because they are dark, you don't know what you're going to find up there.
Continuing our occasional series, uncovering the secrets of the home.
It's a joy, that idea of climbing up into an attic and finding boxes that haven't been opened for 10, 20, 30, 100 years, maybe more.
I'm Rachel Hurdley. As a sociologist, I'm fascinated by the symbolism of attics, what they reveal about us, and how they can inspire us.
For a writer, an attic is a really good place to write about. Your character is going to grow if they're locked in an attic.
The Hidden History of the Attic on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds. Tomorrow lunchtime at 1:30.
I think mine could tell a few stories. Now, though, it's to our first guest of the day. It's Sarah Keith Lucas.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning. And now the shipping forecast, issued by the Met Office on behalf of the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency at 05:05 on Saturday, the 22nd of April 2023. There are warnings of gales in Viking, Fair Isle and Faroes. The general synopsis at midnight. New low expected 4th 1008 by midnight tonight. New low expected west of Biscay 1003 by same time. The area forecast for the next 24 hours. Viking, north at Zera. Northerly or northeasterly 5 to 7, occasionally 4 at first, occasionally gale 8 later in Viking. Fog patches at first, rain or showers later, moderate or good, occasionally very poor at first. South at Zera, 40s, Cromarty, 4th Tyne. Easterly or northeasterly becoming cyclonic 4 to 5, occasionally 3 at first in South at Zera, occasionally 6 later in 40s and Cromarty. Rain or showers, thundery at first in Tyne, fog patches, moderate or good, occasionally very poor. Dogger, Fisher, German Bight, Humber. Cyclonic 4 or 5. Rain or showers, thundery at first except in Fisher. Fog patches, moderate or good, occasionally very poor. Thames. Variable 3 or 4, becoming south or southwest 4 or 5. Rain or showers, fog patches, moderate or good, occasionally very poor. Dover, white. East or southeast 3 or 4, veering south or southwest 4 or 5, increasing 6 for a time in white. Rain or showers, moderate or good. Portland, Plymouth. East or southeast 4 or 5, becoming cyclonic 5 to 7, decreasing 3 or 4 later. Rain or showers, moderate or good. Biscay, Fitzroy, Seoul. Cyclonic 5 to 7, occasionally 4 at first. Rain or showers, moderate or good. Lundy, Fastnet, Irish Sea, Shannon. East or northeast, becoming cyclonic 4 or 5. Rain or showers, moderate or good. Brockall, Malin, Hebrides, Bailey. Northeast 5 to 7, occasionally 4 at first, perhaps gale 8 later except in Malin. Rain or showers, moderate or good. Fair Isle, Faroes, southeast Iceland. Northeasterly 5 to 7, occasionally 4 at first in Fair Isle, occasionally gale 8 later in Fair Isle and Faroes. Rain or showers, fog patches at first in Fair Isle, moderate or good, occasionally very poor at first in Fair Isle. And now the weather reports from coastal stations for 0400. Tyree Automatic. East by north 3. 16 miles, 1013, falling. Stornoway. Northeast 3. More than 38 miles, 1015, falling. Lerwick. Northeast 3. 15 miles, 1017, falling. Lucas. West by north 1. 30 miles, 1013, falling. Bridlington, northeast by north 4, 1005, falling. Sandetti light vessel automatic, southeast 3, 5 miles, 1006. Greenwich light vessel automatic, 5 miles, 1006. Jersey, east-southeast 3, mist 3 miles, 1005, now rising. Channel light vessel automatic, east by south 5, 1005. Scilly automatic, east by south 5, 6 miles, 1004, falling slowly. Valentia, east 3, 22 miles, 1006, now rising. Roddlesway, northeast 3, 1008, falling more slowly. Malin Head, east 4, 16 miles, 1010, falling. And here is the weather forecast for the inshore waters of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, valid for the following 24 hours, issued by the Met Office at 0500. General situation. A complex area of low pressure will track northeast into the UK during Saturday. This will then move away east or northeast on Sunday and overnight into Monday. Cape Wrath to Rattray Head, including Orkney. Northeast 5 to 7, occasionally 4 at first. Fog patches at first, rain or showers later. Moderate or good, occasionally very poor at first. Rattray Head to Berwick upon Tweed. Northerly or northeasterly 4 or 5, occasionally 6 later in north. Fog patches at first, rain or showers later. Moderate or good, occasionally very poor at first. Berwick upon Tweed to Whitby. East or northeast becoming cyclonic 4 or 5. Rain or showers with fog patches, moderate or good. Whitby to Gibraltar Point. Cyclonic 4 or 5. Rain or showers with fog patches, moderate or good, occasionally very